Lesson 49, Basic Accent Rules. So, Catherine, in the last lesson, we told them that they didn't really need to know all the accent rules, but now we're teaching them accent rules. What's going on here?
Well, I think the key word in that phrase that we were talking about in the last lesson is all. We're not saying that that the student should not memorize any accent rules at this point. We're just saying that the student doesn't have to memorize all of the many, many accent rules that if he or she opens another Greek textbook, it'll be right there, a very long list of rules. What you've given them in this lesson are some very selected basic accent rules that are really useful at this early stage, but don't get into the weeds of when exactly to use the accents in which situations in all the different possibilities, which is what a student will find if he or she opens another Greek textbook.
So this lesson is a mere drop in the proverbial bucket of accent knowledge. And we're not even really teaching actual accent rules here in this lesson. We're teaching more basic skills that you need to work with accents, wouldn't you say?
Yes. So key terms, key concepts, which then will form the basis of accent rules later on. But right now, there's just some terminology that the student needs to know up front.
So this is extremely basic stuff that you need to work with accents and to understand. For example, if you read an accent rule, you need this information to know what the rule even means, to know what it's referring to.
Because chances are it's going to be using some technical terms that we don't use in everyday conversation.
So the first thing here in this lesson is to divide up a word into syllables. And I don't want to go into too much detail here. There's a lot you can say about this.
Mm-hmm.
The fancy word that goes with this is syllabification, right?
Yes, which basically means looking at a word and breaking it down into its syllables and understanding its syllables. But the term is syllabification.
So having the ability to divide up a Greek word into its individual syllables, that's a good skill to have.
Definitely.
And we don't need to go into too much detail, but you just need to be able to feel the different syllables in a word.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have the word georgos, it has 3 syllables, georgos. Not too complicated.
But one thing, Bill, that I think is worth pointing out, even with a relatively short word like this, is that when we're counting syllables in ancient Greek words, we don't count from the front, we count from the end. We don't count from the start of the word, we count from the end of the word and go backwards.
That's right, because accents are placed onto words counting from the end toward the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
So the last syllable of the word is like an anchor that you count from.
Exactly.
And so the skill we're going to learn in this lesson is that skill of counting from back to front and identifying the syllables.
Mm-hmm.
So to make a long story short, we need to identify the last syllable, then we need to identify what is the next to last syllable, and so on and so forth. We need to count backwards and identify and number the syllables from the end, going backwards.
Right. And this is important for accent placement because an accent can only go on one of the last 3 syllables of a Greek word.
So you're saying that I can't have, for the word didaskalos, I can't put the accent on the 4th syllable from the end? I can't say didaskalos.
Correct. We cannot do that. We cannot put an accent on the D in didaskalos. We have to put it on either the das or the ka or the los, but it cannot go on the D.
So in a Greek word, only the last 3 syllables are candidates for having the accent. And different kinds of accents can go on different syllables, but at a very basic level, we can boil it down to this, that accents can only go on the last 3 syllables of a word.
Right.
There's one particular kind of accent that can only go on the last syllable. There's another kind of accent that can only go on the last or next to last.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's yet another kind of accent that can go on last, next to last, or third from the end.
Right.
So we have 3 different flavors of accents, each with its own characteristics. So as you go along, you'll learn about the different accents and the different characteristics they have, how they work, and what syllables they can go on. But in this lesson, we're just giving you some basic principles that will help you get to that point.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Catherine, in these books I write, I try to avoid overly academic terminology, fancy names that can confuse people.
Right.
But I think at this point, it is probably a good idea to tell them the different names of the accents.
Yes. Because otherwise, we have to go through long descriptive phrases that are just easier to say in one word by teaching them the terminology. So instead of saying the accent that goes from down to up, we can just say acute.
So, Catherine, why don't you take us through this chart here and tell us about the different kinds of accents that students will see as they study ancient Greek?
So the first one is what's called the acute, and that one goes down to up in a sort of diagonal line. And it's...
Aw, it's so cute.
I know. It's a tiny little mark.
Oh, you don't mean acute.
Yeah, so
I think I've made that joke before. So.
That's okay. It's open for it. So it's an acute.
So, Catherine, the acute accent, the actual name acute means something like sharp, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm. It does.
And where can that accent go? What syllables can the acute accent be found on?
So this one is the most versatile because it can be found on the last syllable, the next to last syllable, and the third from the end, depending on the word and its various endings. So this one is the one that you see very often in Greek.
And in fact, in this lesson, we saw that on the word didaskalos.
Right.
It's on the syllable that's the third from the end.
We also saw it on georgos because it was on the last syllable there.
Okay, and what's next?
Next is the grav, which is the one that goes from up to down in a diagonal line. And grav means heavy, so if that helps, it's so heavy it dragged itself down. This is the one that can only go on the final syllable of a word.
And the idea with that is that if there's an acute accent on the last syllable of a word, and it's followed by another word, you know, if the text keeps going, that turns into a grav accent.
Right.
So you'll often see a grav accent at the end of a word, and that's really the only syllable it can go on, right, Catherine?
Exactly. It can only go on the last syllable, and it only goes on the last syllable when that last syllable is followed by another word. And then finally, we have the circumflex, which is the one that has 2 different forms. One form, it looks like an upside-down smiley or a frown, and in the other form, it looks like a tilde. It's the same accent. It does the same exact things. It's just depends on which Greek font is being used, whether it's going to look like the upside-down smile or the tilde. Well, and that one goes on either the last syllable of a word or the next to last syllable of a word. It cannot go on the third syllable from the end.
And I think the word circumflex can help you remember what it looks like because it has the word flex in it. So you can imagine that curved circumflex flexing, right? It's kind of bending in the sense of flexing.
Yeah. And that makes sense because the ending part of that word, flex, comes from a word in Latin that means to bend. So it's the bendy accent.
It's flecto, right? Flecto,
yeah, flecto, flectere.
And then circum in Latin means around, right? So literally it means to bend around.
Yeah, so the accent that bends around, which since it's a curvy accent, does make sense.
And again, you know, it just depends on the typeface that a publisher decides to use, the font that a publisher decides to use. That's really the only determining factor in whether it looks like a curve or a tilde. But as you said a moment ago, it's exactly the same character regardless of how it looks. It's doing the exact same thing.